Hey everyone and welcome back. Now in today's video we'll be discussing about the interface endpoints. Now before we go ahead and discuss more about it, let's quickly revise one of the downsides of the gateway VPC endpoint. So in this type of approach, the VPC endpoint was created outside of the VPC. So as we were discussing, you have a EC2 instance in a VPC and a gateway endpoint is outside of the VPC, and the traffic from EC2 to the VPC endpoint was controlled through the route tables. And because of this type of architecture, there were a lot of limitations, like you cannot really go ahead and connect directly from VPNs or direct connects and various other services. So the next generation of the VPC endpoints are the interface endpoints. So an interface endpoint is basically an elastic network interface with a private IP address from the IP address range of your subnet. So now what will happen, let's say you want to connect to the S3 service or a SQS service or any other AWS services which are supported privately, then you route the traffic to the interface VPC endpoint. So this interface VPC endpoint is within the same VPC and also has the same IP address range as part of your subnet. And this acts as an entry point to the traffic which are destined towards the AWS services. So as the name suggests, this is nothing but an elastic network interface that is created. Now, before we go ahead and proceed further, let's quickly look into it in a demo perspective so that our concept is much more clear. So currently for today's video, here you see that I have an interface endpoint. So under the endpoint type, I have an interface endpoint that is created, and the service to which this interface endpoint is associated with is a EC2 service here. Now from the EC2 console, if we go a bit down, you have a network interfaces, and here there are multiple network interfaces here. As we were discussing, interface endpoint is nothing but a network interface. So if we'll quickly look into the interface endpoint details, and if we quickly go to the subnet, you see that this interface endpoint is associated with multiple subnets, and these are the network interface ID. So let's just open up one among them. So this is the exact network interface ID over here. Let's look into the details. So under the interface type, you will see that it is a VPC endpoint here. Now for today's demo, I have two EC2 instances that are available. Both are within the public subnet, and one is associated with the interface endpoint. So this one is associated with the interface endpoint, and the second EC2, again, it is in a different public subnet, but it is not associated with the interface endpoint. So we'll connect to both of them and we'll look into how the traffic is routed towards the AWS service. So first, let's go ahead and connect to the first EC2 instance, which is not associated with the interface endpoint. So from the SSH terminal, let me go ahead and quickly connect here. In fact, we'll go ahead and use multiple tabs because I wanted to show you the network connection through TCP dumps. Great. Now, when you quickly do a AWS EC2 describe instances, let's also specify region of US East 1 just for our demo. Alright, so it is basically giving you certain output with the details of the EC2 instances that are running. Now in order to quickly verify to which IP address this API call is made, let's go ahead from a different tab. We'll run a TCP dump towards the destination port of 443. Alright, so it is capturing traffic. Let's go ahead and run the EC2 describe instances yet again. And now if you'll see the traffic from this specific instance with IP 172.31.36.89. So if you'll verify 172.31.36.89 here, it is going towards a public IP which is 52.46.146.93. So this is basically a public IP of the AWS endpoint. So this, we have made a query to the EC2 endpoint over here. So this is one part. Now, as we are discussing, we can also go ahead and associate a EC2 with an interface endpoint, and then all the traffic will go towards the interface endpoint. There is no need of having a direct internet connection. So for this, I also have one more EC2 instance over here, and let's go ahead and try the same demo here. So let me go ahead and copy the public IP. I'll quickly log out from the first EC2 instance. Let's go ahead and connect to the second EC2 now. And let's also copy this up. Let's log out and let's connect in a second terminal. Perfect. So even in this EC2, if we'll quickly do a AWS EC2 describe instances with the region of US East 1, as expected, things are working well. So now let's go ahead and run the TCP dump command yet again on the destination port of 443, and let's do a EC2 describe instances. And now from a TCP dump, again you will see that the traffic is going towards a public endpoint. So this is primarily because we had explicitly specified the region over here, and the region is US East 1. So this is a different region from which the interface endpoint is created. So now if we change this region, let's say because this region is primarily the AP Northeast 3. So let's do one thing. Let's change the region to AP Northeast 3. Let's do a Control C and let's run the TCP dump command yet again. Let's press enter, and this time you will see that the traffic is going towards a interface endpoint, which is 172.168.133. So if you want to quickly verify that, let's go to the subnet. You will see that this is the interface endpoint to which the traffic is redirected to, which is 172.168.133. Alright, so from the EC2, the traffic goes to the interface endpoint. From the interface endpoint, then through the AWS private network, the traffic is redirected to the appropriate service. So not only you can go ahead and take the benefit of interface endpoint only for the private subnet, but as we looked into today's demo, you can also associate interface endpoint in a public subnet. And depending upon the region where you make a query to, the traffic will either go through the internet gateway or it will go to the interface endpoint, and everything is very seamless, so you do not really need to worry about anything there. So before we conclude, let's look into some of the benefits of interface endpoint. First one is that the interface endpoint enables the use of security group to restrict the access to the endpoint. Now since this is a EN address is available, a security group will be associated with that. So at a security group level also, you can go ahead and control which is the source IP that is allowed to connect to the VPC endpoint. So if I have to quickly show you, if you'll see, you have a security group and you have a security group name called as default that is associated with it. Now if I'll quickly open this, you have all the traffic that is allowed, but depending upon the customization that you do, you can restrict a lot of source traffic here. Now the second benefit, primarily because the interface endpoints are residing in the same VPC, is that various connections like VPNs and direct connects are supported here. And the third one is that the interface endpoint supports a lot of services unlike the gateway endpoint. So as we are discussing, gateway endpoint primarily they support S3 and DynamoDB, but there are a lot of other AWS services for which you might want a private connectivity to, and that is where the interface endpoint really comes into picture. So let's go back to the endpoints over here. Let's create an endpoint. And within here, you will see that for a lot of services, in fact, let me maximize this. So for a lot of services, you have auto scaling, you have CloudFormation, CloudTrail, AWS Config, DynamoDB, EBS EC2, and so many others. You see the primary type is interface endpoint. And this is one of the great benefits that the interface endpoint provides. That's great. So I hope with this you understood the basics of interface endpoints. Again, for today's video, we had a slightly different architecture so that our learning also continues there. So for today's video, we had used a public EC2 instance, and depending upon the region, we looked into how the traffic is automatically directed towards either an internet gateway, or if the traffic is towards the services in the same region, it is automatically redirected towards the interface endpoints. So with this, we'll conclude today's video.